It's wonderful to see some of you this morning, and I know folks are still filtering in. I want to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover, and we want to make sure we get to all your questions and are able to really have this kickoff conversation. I think it's really timely to be doing this at the beginning of the year as people are sort of considering what commitments they want to make, and I can't think of a better time to be considering this question of the tech that comes next. My name is Colleen Chen. I'm a professor in the law school at Santa Clara. This event is being sponsored by the High Tech Law Institute, as well as the Markkula Center for Applied Ethics. And you are here for a book talk on the tech that comes next by Afua Bruce and Amy Sample Ward. And we are lucky enough to have Afua here today. And Tara McGinnis will be moderating along with myself. So I did want to mention that we are recording this, and we will be taking your questions. We welcome your questions using the Q&A function. But I think at this moment in this juncture in time, as we welcome folks from the engineering school, business school, and our community within Santa Clara, as well as within the Digital 44 and other communities, this question of what exactly are we wanting to do with respect to technology? What is our vision, and how do we actually bring that forward is extremely timely. And we'll be talking about it both sort of at the policy level as we are at the beginning of the midterm elections are behind us, and we're thinking about what can we do in this new Congress. We're thinking about sort of the different sets of issues that are facing a world coming out of COVID. And trying to recapture the gains in policy. And so anyway, this whole set of questions, I think, raises the question of how technology will play a role, policy for the technology, and then how does the technology actually work to inform the policy. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to Tara McGinnis. We're extremely privileged to have her moderating to start. And then we will get into the conversation with Afua. I want to encourage you all to buy the book if you haven't already. It's terrific and has something, I think, for a lot of different audiences. We'll talk about how the book is structured, but I really appreciated that there is not only sections for, sort of philanthropists and funders and engineers and computer scientists, but also for policymakers, for those of you who are affiliated with the law school or in the policy community, for ethicists and others. And so it's really readable. It's very, very practical and has just a lot of information and I think a lot of content that can really help in whatever realm you're working in to help you drive the conversation forward. So let me start by introducing Tara, who is the founder of the New Practice Lab at the New America Foundation. She leads there a team of designers, researchers, and project managers working to improve family economic security and well-being. She has spent her career in public service, in nonprofits, congressional offices, think tanks in the federal government, including the White House. She led the domestic policy team for the Biden transition and was part of planning the first 100 days of the Biden presidency. Tara served as a senior advisor to President Obama, where she was responsible for leading the effort to sign up millions of Americans for free and low-cost health insurance through Obamacare. And it was this deep engagement on the team implementing the Affordable Care Act, both its failures and its turnaround, that sparked her obsession with delivery and how policy reaches those who need it most. She continued to focus on the next generation of problem solvers by teaching how to solve problems in the digital age to graduate policy students at Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. In 2021, Tara co-authored Power to the Public, the Promise of Public Interest Technology, described by President Obama as worth a read for anyone who cares about making change happen. Tara, I'll turn it over to you now.
I could not be more excited to be here, Colleen, with you and with my a leader in the field and someone who I'm delighted to call my friend, Afua Bruce. But I'm going to make sure that we do kind of a broad tour of the tech that comes next and hear from Afua about why she wrote it. But I do want to have a chance, in case you didn't get a chance to or haven't met Afua, to tell you a little more about Afua. And I want to pull out certain parts of her career for those of you who are earlier on and thinking about what is this field. Afua, as you know, is a leading public interest technology. She is truly a unique intersectional player. She's worked in nonprofit, private, and academic sectors, including right now leading the A&B advisory group. So if you get into this conversation and you decide you need more help and the book is not enough, Fua is running a consulting firm that tackles some of these questions about implementation and data. But she's had a wide range of roles over her career. Just to pull out a few: Chief Program Officer at DataKind. She was Executive Director of the White House National Science and Technology Council. We had the chance to overlap at two of her previous employers, New America, where she led the public interest technology work. Her federal service has spanned the FBI, but she also has a deep private sector experience. And I think lifting up the type of tri-sector problem solvers we need and how we get to the next generation of technology is going to involve more folks like Afua, who has a bachelor's degree in computer engineering from Purdue and a master's degree in business administration. So it's really the breadth of Afua's experience that you'll hear come through in what shows up on how we build the next generation of tech. So I'm delighted to introduce Afua. I hope maybe we can kick it off just by starting with, like, why'd you write the book?
Well, Tara, thanks so much for that introduction. Colleen, thanks for having me today. I am so honored to be in conversation with you both today. The book, The Tech That Comes Next, came out early last year, in March of last year, and it was a lot of fun to write, honestly, and it's been a lot of fun to talk about. I wrote the book because of a couple of things. One is that when we have conversations about the ethics of technology, they're often centered around all the things that are going wrong and all the things that could go wrong. But we really wanted to write this book to reframe the conversation, to imagine what can go right when we use technology as a way to really advance equity. And so really wanted an opportunity to think about really how can we use technology to advance equity? How can we really make the best use of technology so that it does positively serve us all. And then the other reason that we wrote the book was honestly to tell the stories of people who are doing really good work today. There's something like, I think, over 3 dozen people quoted in the book. And so when you read the book, you'll see examples from people who are working to use technology to better solve food insecurity, to help improve graduation rates, to help improve access to digital technologies in the US, to help improve access to lighting outside of the US as well. And so it was really exciting and really important to tell the stories of people who are developing technology well, who are developing it in really community-centered, ethical ways to have a positive impact in the world.
I have my favorite stories, and I'm glad you lifted up the dozens of voices, but maybe I'll ask you for yours. Is there one or, one of these stories that you want to single out for us to get to that granular level of what it looks like when tech is built differently through the folks you interviewed?
Oh man, this is like asking me to choose my favorite child, I suppose. I love all of the stories. Thank you to everyone.
You can do 2. This is a long conversation.
Right. So in that case, I'll pick 2. So one of the stories that we share is that of an organization called Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, which started in New York City. And Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, as the name might imply, rescued leftover cuisine. So took high quality leftover food from one place and then provided it to people who were facing food insecurity. And when RLC started, it was operating at a very human scale in that they literally walked to the restaurants, picked up the food, then walked or biked it over to people who needed meals that night. And as they looked to grow, as they had more people involved with this operation, whether volunteers or restaurants, the leadership of RLC said, we should probably have some type of tech that helps us figure out how to know where people are and know where the food is and know who needs food that night. So they engaged a nonprofit tech consulting company to build a system. But what they did, and why we highlighted them, is because instead of going through your traditional technology development process where you might talk to 1 or 2 people at the organization who need it, you develop the technology, and then you go ahead and deploy it to only the IT people who need it, RLC instead created a really open forum. I used a tool to put all of the requirements in, and they gave access to not just the tech folks on their staff, but to the entire organization, to people from the restaurants who were providing food, to some volunteers, to some people who were recipients. So everyone could see what was being built and what was being prioritized. People could sort of upvote or downvote or add new requirements to the system. And then there was transparency when something was deprioritized or prioritized and delivered. And through this process, they developed a tool that really worked for them, that was responsive to the needs of not just the tech person at the nonprofit, but to everyone in this ecosystem. And now, a few years later, Rescuing Leftover Cuisine, in large part because of this platform that helped really enable what they do and helped really advance their operations, has been able to go from operating in that one small neighborhood in New York City to operating in 8 cities across the US. And so I really like that for the way that it was open, it was inclusive, and really took advantage of technology to help actually do the operations of the organization and ultimately to feed more people. Another example I really like from the book is that the story of John Jay College, which is a college in New York City. We have a lot of students who are later in career, who are first generation students. And like many colleges and universities, they spend a lot of time and effort thinking about how do we get people to finish their freshman year and start their sophomore year. And so a lot of resources were put there. But a person who was a fairly new dean at the time was looking at the numbers and said, well, after students get to their first year, we actually see a non-insignificant number of students who complete 3/4 of the credits they need to graduate, but then don't graduate. And why is that, right? If you've completed 3/4 of the credits you need to graduate, you clearly know how to show up for classes, you know how to study, you know how to get your work done. So why aren't they graduating? And so John Jay College partnered with DataKind, which provides data science to nonprofits and government agencies around the world. And so John Jay College asked the data scientists, can anything be done? Can you give us any interesting insights here? And so the data scientists went to work. They partnered with the actual John Jay College staff, the people who are providing these services. They looked at the years of academic data. College institutions tend to collect a lot of data on their students and hold on to it for a while. So there was a lot of useful data. And they ran something like 24 different models until ultimately finding the solution that they ended up with. And this final product was able to identify students who were at risk of not completing their degree, even though they'd completed the 3/4 of credit, 3/4 of credits they needed to graduate. And then on top of that, the tool recommended to the John Jay College staff different interventions to take, whether it was calling students, whether it was finding scholarship money, whether it was something else to support that process. And 2 years after rolling out that software, John Jay College credits that program with helping an additional 900 students graduate. And so when you think of the impact on the lives of not just those 900 students, but their families and people in their neighborhoods as well who benefit, it's really quite impactful. And so again, we have the case of people saying there's some technology out there, but really we're starting with the problem of the organization. We're starting with the problems in our community to really define what needs to be done, figuring out how technology can help that happen, and then celebrating, in this case, the 900 students who graduate. So celebrating the actual outcome and not the technology.
That's one of my favorite stories, and it just shows the power of actually focusing on in where the problem is, starting with that, and then applying the technology there. I wanted to ask one question about, again, thinking from a legal policies perspective. In both of these examples, do you have a sense of how the privacy or other issues were dealt with in terms of the role of the team in sort of thinking about what are the needs, but also how the work can be done in a privacy respecting way? I think that's one question that often will come up. That there can be trade-offs between sort of understanding what's actually working, but also respecting folks' privacy and ensuring that the information is being held in a way that is safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So, certainly in the example with DataKind, DataKind's process, and I used to be chief program officer at DataKind, so I'm intimately familiar with how they work, really does start with the questions of what needs to be done, what access to data do you actually have permission to, not just what data is out there, but what data do you actually have the permission to use and permission to use in this way, and who will have access to and who should have access to not just the data, but any insights from the data at the end. And so those are very intentional conversations that are held at the start, at the middle, and at the end of the entire process. And I know from managing projects at DataKind for a couple of years, there were times where if we got to the end and we weren't satisfied that it still worked, we actually pulled the project and said we can't deliver. And so that does happen from time to time. But with the case of John Jay College, everything was kosher. They had the right access to the tools. I think also what's important in the John Jay College example to note is that the software wasn't just sort of left to its own devices. It wasn't that an algorithm was written once and like now we trust it to work forever and ever by its own. It's automating the decisions about which students on campus will get support, which students won't get support. I think you can get into some ethical questions there. You can get into some real policy questions there if you let the technology, in this case, the AI, operate without any restrictions, without any human interaction. You can have a lot more of those issues. In this case, by really making sure that the technology is in service of the people and in service of the mission. And so it was the actual human staff of John Jay College who was making that final determination. The sort of policy implementation lines are a lot cleaner because you have that final check.
I want to ask you a bit about the perspectives you bring to writing the book. And I think this is true for both you and your co-author, Amy Sample. You have an unusual set of perspectives in the alchemy of creating the tech that comes next. And just like, what from having been trained as an engineer, but also having executed as an MBA, do you think it comes out here in what you saw and recorded and didn't? And I think you could say the same for Amy, who brings another set, running a technology nonprofit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did get my undergraduate degree in computer engineering. I worked at IBM all through undergrad. I worked at IBM after graduating from Purdue as well, before going back a few years later to get my MBA. And so I have a deep love of technology. I think it is amazing. I think building all the things is great. I think everyone should be an engineer. It is wonderful. Technology can do really great things. The business side of me helps me to understand that technology can do great things. Sometimes we can afford those, sometimes we can't. Sometimes we can figure out ways where they can be sustainably done and supported, and sometimes we can't. So how do you put on the right parameters to get technology then not just developed and created, but actually out into the world, into the hands of the right people, and done hopefully in a financially responsible way, mostly on time, and things like that. It is my experience with government and nonprofits, though, that has really, I think, changed my perspective on how we even start the conversation about what to create. And so really making sure that we are starting with the people in mind and really communities in mind. So really going forward and saying, if we are developing something, let's talk to communities to see what communities need. Communities should have some sense of self-determination to be able to articulate what they want. And then as technologists, we can come in and figure out what we actually develop to help really empower communities. This also helps, I think, reframe some of the tech development so that it is then by nature more inclusive, because when you are talking to a wide variety of communities, especially communities who have been historically marginalized or underrepresented, when you solve for those issues, you then are creating a much more inclusive set of technologies that then do things like literally see people. If it's in the case of, I think we talk about automatic faucets in the book, or talk about software as you check your identities, your different demographics, whether it's race, gender, sexuality, or something else, making sure that these systems literally see you is really important. And so that community-centered focus is important. So for me, to get to your question as to how I came to this book, then it really is saying, what's technically possible? What can we technically imagine? And what can we technically create? How do we do it in a way that makes sense, that we can fund it, that it can survive, that it can be sustained? But then ultimately, who is this really for? Are we really serving actual needs? And are we doing it in a way that will actually support humans? Because at the end of the day, that's who we are. That's who we're solving for.
We have a question I'm going to pull out of the queue because it feels relevant here. But this is also a good reminder to pop your questions in the queue. We'd love this to be as fireside chatty and democratic as possible, so feel free to load that up. This questioner asks, would you offer us a definition of public interest technology, particularly in a way that constrains the misuse of the term for any tech that results in public interest or quasi-public interest, but has incidental outcomes? So I thought that was a good one.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think when I think about the definition of public interest technology, I think of it as the application of technology expertise to help the better good, to bring about the better good, to bring about public benefits, and more. I think that woven into that definition then is the fact that you need a multidisciplinary approach. It's not just technologist, but it's technologist and non-technologist, right? It's technologist and policymakers and sociologists and more who are really coming together for all of that. I think of public interest technology also as something that isn't confined specifically to the public sector. This approach of how are we doing something that is community centered? How are we doing something that really has the tech and policy elements together does cross all sectors. I've been in many sectors and have seen the application or the need for the application of public interest technology in the private sector, in the nonprofit sector, in the government sector, in the academic sector. And so I think that ability for it to apply across sectors is also woven into that. And then finally, I've touched on it a little bit, but making sure that as we think about public interest technology, we are looking for the tech and policy piece in nearly everything we do. And so making sure that as we're developing policy, we can think about, well, how's this technology going to be able to help us implement this or not? And even as we're developing technology, what types of policies need to be created or are we responding to help inform the development of technology?
There's so much there that I want to sort of springboard off of, but I think if we stick with the kind of question around public interest technology, I think in the legal field, the field of public interest law, it has provided some inspiration or at least a role model for public interest technology. And I was wondering to both of you, since you've both been intimately involved in the creation of this public interest technology network at the university level and beyond, what you see as similar or different in terms of getting the community together to start to really make this into a field and an option for folks when they graduate.
I can start, and then we'll pass to Tara to give what I'm sure will be a more comprehensive and coherent example. But in starting the Public Interest Technology University Network, which Tara and I, along with others at New America, helped start maybe 5-ish years ago, we did look to the field of public interest law for lessons, right? And that we wanted to learn from how to sort of create a field, how to really build a field around taking people who are trained in their discipline, to be expert in the discipline, and then apply them to some of the biggest public interest challenges that we see. So I think we took a lot of inspiration there. I think one significant way that public interest tech differs from public interest law, though, is that the definition of technologist is really broad, right? And even, as I was describing, public interest technology includes technologist and non-technologist. And so whereas public interest law, you are looking at lawyers only, public interest technologists, the field actually includes space for technologists, for lawyers, for the sociologists, and for others. And so I think that's one of the biggest differences between public interest tech and public interest law. Tara, I'll pass it over to you.
Not surprisingly, we had a very similar, I think this makes growing the field, pulling out on where AFUA started. It means you don't just expand what you teach in law school and what types of clinics and nonprofits there are to go to. It means that there's a broader set of degrees and experiences that you could have to be a public interest technologist. So that are, dual degrees or single degrees. And it makes, I think, growing the field a little more complex than growing the field of public interest law, but really to the credit of Darren Walker and Anne Marie Slaughter, folks who came up in an era when the public interest law field was being burgeoned into early environmental law and early civil rights law, that you could grow up and be a lawyer and work in the public interest and not simply in the private sector, was a thread that the Ford Foundation had a role in playing in the growing of public interest law, and has had a role of growing in public interest tech. So there are some of the analogy carries. I think some of the imagination has to be more expansive in this space. Afua, maybe taking this back, something I want to just make sure I'm echoing back you said, and of that you could be a public interest technologist and work for a company. You could be a public interest you could be an engineer making something more equitable on the product delivery side, and that is squarely back to this expansive tent. I want to just pull on that thread and ask you to say a little bit more about who are public interest technologists, and where are they? Where do you find them, especially in your own work?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find public interest technologists everywhere. And so I think, from the business side, I think one thing that I find especially exciting is the different kinds of companies that are being created right now, and are created with more social minded mindsets there, or more even responsible tech and responsible innovation mindsets. And so you see over the past 5 years, I think you've seen an increase in the number of social enterprises, whether they're B Corps or even your regular startups that have from the start a thought of how are we going to make sure our development process has inclusion built into it? How are we going to make sure that our deployment process is thinking about communities first and what that looks like? How do we start to articulate that to venture capitalists? How do we start to work with VCs to say that these are trade-offs that you may want to make, or you may want to consider as far as sort of time to market and the community impact go. So I think that's really exciting. We've also seen an increase in even large tech companies in their interest in looking to also improve or update product development processes, or sometimes to be more responsive to policy rather. Sometimes that is out of the goodness of their heart. Sometimes it is out of things like HUD bringing a case against Facebook to say that the way you implemented your search algorithm for housing is a violation of the Fair Housing Act. And so you need to go back to the drawing board and recognize that these policies and laws that we have in place apply to your technology also. And so now create a new algorithm, and then just to make sure it was created correctly, we, the government, are going to periodically check back in with you to make sure that it works. And so I think we are seeing more and more of that as well.
I'm going to go ahead and pull a couple of questions from the chat in. I think your comments are sparking a lot of thought and introspection. So one question is around when tech actually has a public interest, what role does public funding have in that? So this is a question from Matthew Bauman, and he's asking about at the end of the funding, should the public have an interest in the profits reaped from technology developed with public funding? Should we require open sourcing of all code developed with public funding? So when the public interest is actually, developed in the public interest is reflected in the funding coming from the public sector, should that have downstream implications, I think is the question.
Oh, goodness. This is a question that people have very, very strong opinions on. And I actually don't. I will say that, so I think the question is, if especially it sounds like we're talking about for-profit companies, but any company or organization is able to develop technology and it works and they put it out in the world, how much should they profit off of it versus if some of their initial research or development was funded by public dollars, how much should the public then reap from that? I think there is merit to saying that the public should reap some of the benefits from that if it's the public investment. I also think this is part of the function of government, right? When we look at a lot of the technology innovations, a lot of the basic research is done, has historically been done by the government. We look at the creation of the internet, for example, a lot of the basic research and a lot of the initial functionality was done by the government. We look even at a lot of advanced technologies that came out of, actually, not even just advanced technologies, but Velcro that came out of things like the government spending money on a space program and figuring out what was needed. And then those inventions go out into the world. You look at it even more broadly and you look at the number of graduate students or postdocs across the country that are funded by NSF grants or NIH grants, the government heavily funds the research and development and talent development for the tech industry or for the science and tech field more broadly. That said, I think a lot of what incentivizes the creation of new businesses and more is the opportunity to take some of those, to reap the benefit from some of those investments and put your own spin on it and figure out how you create a market for it, how you then tie to the communities to figure out what those communities need, how to use the technology in those ways. And so I think that making sure that we have a structure that still allows for that innovation and that creation to continue is really important. Does it need to be unbounded to the extent that some of the people working in these organizations can't feed themselves on a daily basis? No, we can put in some restrictions there, and I think make sure that some of the public reaps those benefits there. But I think I mostly lie on the side of part of these investments are the function of government and why government exists.
I think it's a great answer. And I think this question is important now, especially as we move to implement a number of the large expenditure bills that have been passed Congress, and we'll be spending a lot of money on technology. And I would point the questioner also to just the whole field of R&D innovation funding that's been happening for a long time. And in the innovation space in particular, there's sort of frameworks for ensuring that those who use public funds both are responsible in how they use them, but also have the incentive to continue to commercialize and scale the technology. So I think there is this balance between giving folks incentives to use, seed funding from the government and really have a large impact, but also ensuring that the public doesn't sort of pay twice and they are able to reap the benefit. So important question, and I think a good framework to draw upon.
I'd love to pull another question from the queue and go back to something, Afua, you were raising in your last answer of, in the end, are we making sure we're connecting to the communities that work? But before I do that, for folks who are joining in a little late, I want to pop in this website for the tech that comes next and remind you that there's no time like the present to buy a copy of this book. So that link is right there. It's almost Valentine's Day. I mean, if you're joining this discussion, there's someone you love who needs a copy of this book. I do think part of growing the field is having a library of perspectives that show what the next generation is and what is possible. And even a matter of years ago, you couldn't fill a bookshelf with books about the nexus of a more inclusive vision of technology. And this book is a really important contribution. So I just want to make sure that it's a good time right now to click. You can pay attention and purchase a book for your Valentine. But coming back to a question in the queue, and I think something that you are constantly reminding us, Afua, how can governments, municipal, county, and state better engage with their diverse constituents to ensure that the technology they just deploy really responds to the needs of their community rather than the pitches of tech companies or potentially even senior leaders in government?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I honestly think the answer is quite simple. You can talk to them. And so you can talk to them. You can talk to historically marginalized communities to talk to them about what they want and what they need, and make sure that they're involved in development process for whether that's policy or for a specific technology, and then make sure they're included in the evaluation process as well as to what is working, what is not working. Part of the reason why we say historically marginalized communities is because they've been historically marginalized because we haven't been having those conversations. And so the way to change that is to have those conversations and to be intentional about inclusivity. And that does mean taking the time, dedicating the resources, both time and personnel, to have those conversations and to bring that out.
I will say that I think, I have another written sort of about this turnout problem that I think that this model of democratic participation is very important and obviously at the center of sort of the administrative state. Agencies need to figure out who they're serving, what their needs are, and really have a user-centered perspective. But we do have this full participation in voting. Did anybody hear what I had said earlier?
I think do 2 sentences back, Colleen, just so we make sure we missed one.
Oh, okay. I was just picking up on this theme of democratic engagement and engaging stakeholders, which is so important to, the regulatory state and ensuring that we are user-centered. But I think there is continues to be this challenge of what I call the turnout problem, just in that we don't have, sort of full participation voting. It's also difficult to sometimes get folks to engage in what is or isn't working. So I was wondering if you had seen some models for community engagement and participatory governance that had worked well. And I think on the research side, there is a desire to say, well, even if people are unable to necessarily participate actively, if we can do evaluation, we can actually ensure that we get the permissions to figure out, did this program have an impact? Did it actually do what we thought it would? That can also serve as a good feedback loop to figure out if things are actually taking.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly on the feedback loop side, I agreed with that. And I think we've seen some models where that works. As far as engagement on the front end, especially of policy creation, I think there are a couple of things that work. One is making sure that policymakers do have time and are able to go into the community and to have these conversations, sometimes directly, sometimes through sort of trusted intermediaries, especially if you're working in communities that you being there is new, and so need to do a little bit of trust building. Leveraging some trusted partners, I think, is really helpful. In the book, we give an example of some work that was done for digital equity and digital and access to broadband and the like. And there we highlighted one organization that was essentially an advocacy organization that had a lot of members of grassroots nonprofits. And so that was a way for these organizations that are working with communities on a day-to-day basis, that are comprised of people in these communities who may not have the time and ability to lobby their policymakers or interact with their policymakers, to then come together through this advocacy organization. And that is the organization that then took forward the recommendations and did a lot of the day-to-day work. So in as much as you can support the creation of those and the ability of those grassroots organizations to participate, I think that's really important. And then thinking also about how you leverage technology to have some of these conversations. So things like open comment periods, or things like texting campaigns and the like, to get people to respond. Maybe they can't show up for a school board meeting, but they can answer a handful of text over a couple of days about some of the issues that are there. And so thinking also about ways that you can use technology to really create those conversations and to make sure that they happen. Not just, at 2 p.m. on every other Thursday, where some people may or may not be able to physically get to the place at that time.
I want to move to more questions, and I encourage people to pop into the chat their questions. But maybe before we do so, and kind of closing out this phase of the conversation, I'd love to just ask you, there are a lot of critical points that you guys make in the book. Is there, if you left people with one key takeaway, something you want to make sure no one misses, just kind of open the floor on key thing you needed to make sure people understand?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think the key thing for people to take away is that regardless of what your role is, whatever your day job is, there is something that you specifically can do to make technology better work for equity in this world. It's not always someone else's job. It's not that you have to do everything by yourself, but there is a piece that you can identify for you specifically to do to move this conversation and the actual work forward.
I think it dovetails well with a question from Lene's story about how we can help for-profit orgs understand their role in public interest tech. I think you already mentioned whether it's a company responding to an inquiry by or a lawsuit by a federal agency, or just responding to different laws that might be coming down the pipe. I think the Lene is asking a little bit more, that it still feels like public interest is part of the public. It's not really the job of the for-profit sector. So I don't know if you want to respond to different ways to try to engage the for-profit organizations that are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a long process. I think finding the right people within those organizations to start these conversations with and continue the conversations with matters. I think sometimes we see big tech companies, for example, as a big tech company and this sort of monolith out there, but recognizing that large tech companies have teams that are dedicated to different things, have people there. And so finding the right teams to start some of this work to start the conversation. I think also it's important to recognize the reality of the incentive structures that we currently have in our society, of especially like profit at all cost. And so recognizing what can be done and can't be done at different times, I think is really important. So I think it is really exciting to see the creation of new businesses and the creation of new business models to see what can be done to still within the private sector, but to compete with some of the large organizations. I think that's another lever to pull.
For students who might be interested in who are computer science engineers or other technologists that are students, I think there is this desire to sort of maybe create an app or do something to respond to something that they're seeing where there's a great need. And I was really interested in the part of the book that said that shouldn't necessarily be the first step you take. So I wanted to ask you a little more about why create an app is not necessarily always the right answer and what instead should be the right first steps to actually solve and address a problem that you see in the world.
Yeah, great question. And so I just want to go back to, I too am an engineer. I am speaking your language. If this is you and you're like, I see a problem in the world, I know I will just create an app and I will solve it. I understand that impulse. And yes, strongly urge you to throw it away. The way to start is really to engage in the actual conversation with organizations. What we've seen, I think, time and time again, is really well-meaning engineers and technologists say like, oh my goodness, I can create a website, I can create an app, and it'll be great. And so we have all of these really well-designed apps that are never used. And so, it's a well-designed app, but if it's never used, does it matter? I don't know that it does. I don't think it does. And so again, this is why the conversations with the communities, with really starting with what do communities need, what do communities want, why it really matters. Another example that we have in the book is Project Sunbird, which is an organization in Myanmar, and the founder of the organization is in the U.S. The organization is U.S. based. It works in Myanmar, and the founder is from Myanmar but lives in the U.S. now. And so even with this organization, they were creating lights to go into Myanmar so people could have light, could read, could study, could do all of the things. And, started by someone who's from Myanmar. And when he started the work and they designed the technology. He was working on the team with other people here in the US, and they went to deploy it and it didn't work. The technology technically worked, the lights turned on, but it was too loud, it was too bright at different times, it was difficult to turn on and off. And so it wasn't practical for that situation. And so here you have a case of someone who, in this case, actually had spent significant time, born and raised in that environment, but hadn't been there for a while, partnered with others with some strong technical expertise to develop a solution for a problem that, in this case, even the community had articulated, we would like more light, but it didn't work. And that's because they hadn't lost that community involvement along the way. They would have known as they were designing the light that it didn't work for that environment, right? They needed to change some things. Ultimately, they did, but it required that community involvement. So that is similar to saying, I'm just going to develop an app for this because I know that there's a need and I'm going to create it because, I've read a lot about it and I'm sure I know. You don't know if you haven't talked to the people who are actually going to be using the technology that you're developing, you're using the app that you're developing. It may be an app that they need and you may end up building it. It may be a completely non-technical solution that they need, and you may just support with that. So I think being open there is important.
I think we're right here to talk a little bit about user-centered research, which I kind of hear Afua really referred to in her answer in your own work, and how to actually get to people who have needs and to be able to access them, and the work you do a little bit, if you wouldn't mind talking about it a little bit.
Sure, Colleen. I just want to make sure. I think we lost you at the top. Is that is that directed? That's directed to both of us.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think like a FUA's example of Myanmar and the lights is a reminder that it's not solutions are not static. In fact, like the light solution might have been perfect at a moment in time, but that you need to constantly be community conversations aren't like a one point in time. And that to some extent, if there's magic in the private sector development of technology products, it's in the iteration that we like, for those of us who are, fancy watch wearers or fancy phone carriers, that you upgrade and it doesn't look like the way it did last year and what your needs aren't, whether that's how you use your Spotify or other pieces. And so it's true for lighting, a low-income community, that you need to. It's not a like one-time survey. It doesn't have to be intensive, but it has to be iterative, I think. So I'm happy to talk about this, and I think it comes through in the type that comes next really as an important value that you just need to build, with the people you intend to have a product for. And there's so many barriers to this in both the private and public sector. Like, oh, we don't have enough time. Like, we could walk out on the corner today, and ask people like, how's the bus situation? Like, it just sometimes we in the federal government, when the permission structure was too complicated, you could do real user research on something on a lunch hour. Student loans, you walk to a gathering of where 12 students are eating, you learn more in an hour eating with a set of students. No, you can be more sophisticated in targeting the exact right type of person and the right type of loan, but really like getting out of the office is step one. A really simple way for this, if it's still very intimidating to have the archetype human who uses a service in engagement, and that is what you need to do. A first step might just being like the gal or guy in charge try to do their own form. Or eat their own medicine. Or when I worked on healthcare.gov, like I called the call center more than I would like to confess, and it was just a good check. Like, just check, can they answer my question? Like, this is a hard question. How are we telling people to navigate this? And so that is very lightweight. Obviously, it's much better to have a non-college educated question asked, but also like in the meantime, like 5 people have asked me this question. What are the call centers telling people to do when they get this? Like, you could just call the call center yourself that you're running. So I do think like sometimes the barrier of taking the first step in talking to humans is really big for people. And so a lightweight way, like, what is this company's welcome mat? What is the first experience? Like, when I Google McGinnis LLC, like, what comes up? Is it actually our company? Or, what is this agency's welcome mat? This very lightweight, how would a person find us in the first place? And what is the first thing that comes up? Or what is the first, box of text on our website? Is like a just lightweight way to engage it. On a more sophisticated level, there are 2 teams in the federal government and multiple teams at state level who are experienced in the science of user-centered design and research. And so if you're alone navigating this problem, there are plenty of people to help you. But I think taking the first step of getting closer to what the lived experience is with your program, product, office, can be very lightweight, like walking into the office and trying it yourself.
I so appreciate that. And in my own work, I both do innovation policy and research, but I also have an initiative called Paper Prisons. We're focused on the experience of people with criminal records trying to apply for expungement. And that's a place where there's been a huge gap between the expectation and the hope and the eligibility for getting that second chance and actually delivering it. And many people are working on this topic, and the Clean Slate Initiative is really trying to automate. But what we're still finding is even in the automation, there are a lot of challenges with the data. It's super dirty. And the delivery, I think in the law, we kind of pat ourselves in the back. We passed the law. A lot of the work we do is to support state campaigns, but that's just really the beginning of the implementation cycle. So I'm curious about whether or not you guys have seen the kind of agile development of software it being implemented well in the policy sphere in terms of how we ensure that there actually is delivery. I think this administration, I think a number of us were on the transition team, and there's been a focus on delivery to a greater extent than any other administration. But still, how do we actually operationalize that and ensure that the intent of the lawmakers of the policy actually is fulfilled?
I'm going to pass this to Tara because I think that a lot of the work that you're doing at NPL and other places fits squarely into this question.
I mean, I looked to you guys on other examples, and I was like, oh wow, all three of us were on the transition. Now that I'm just small world of people who care about technology and delivery growing bigger every day, and you on this line can be part of it. The most recent example that comes to mind is the level of effort on the front end into the experience of the student loan forgiveness operation, just to me modeled the next generation of a big, important policy priority that clearly had evolved thinking about simplicity out of the gate in implementation. And so, there's enormous complexity to the policy area of student loans and student loan debt and cancellation. But the out of the gate, I think, rollout of a form that took the knowledge that the government had, didn't refer you back to another agency to validate, took the, minimum number of things that needed to be legally asked to check your eligibility, and just built that rather than the total number of things that government officials would like to collect as they think about how this program is implementing. And it really reflected, I think, interagency collaboration, thinking about delivery while building the policy, at a level that was 2.0 of what I think Afua and I experienced in, 2 administrations ago. So that strikes me as one nice example in the world of bringing closer together the emergent, what's possible, not only like what we want to do, but also what is like delivery-wise possible, and really integrated thinking.
And just one thing, just to pull out of what you said, Tara, that's you sort of glossed over, but I actually think is important as we think about how do we operationalize things and how do we actually make things happen, is that data collection minimization activity of only collecting what is needed. I think sometimes when people start these projects or imagine what could be done, it's like, we have to do everything right now. And so let's collect all the information. Let's take all the plans. Let's make this big grand picture, which, is important to dream. But actually to get moving, just figure out like what that next step is, and then iteratively how you can improve on that, I think is actually really important in making this work.
And I think that statement would be music to the ears, especially of the ethicists on the call, who really, I think there's a consistency between the privacy best practice of data minimization and really actually getting things done. And I have to remind everybody that January 28th is Data Privacy Day. It's International Data Privacy Week. So I'm glad that is dovetailing with this conversation. I do want to also raise a question that John Tello brings up about this title of The Tech That Comes Next, and inviting you a little to talk a little bit more about what you think that means and where you think the energy and the sort of locus of the tech that comes next is going to be operated. He has a very specific question about thinking about fields like ed tech, which might be sort of government. There's a lot of government interest in it, but there's going to be private and public actors in it. But thinking about, what does it mean to say the tech that comes next as applied to that particular that particular vertical? Do you think that there are, specific ideas in terms of it talks about the education market of the future? Can we think about it differently with this frame of the tech that comes next?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. And so we called the book The Tech That Comes Next. We talk a lot about technology in the book, but we also talk a lot about community, because we both, Amy and I really believe that the tech that comes next is technology that is centered around communities, that empowers communities, that enables communities to do the things that they want to do, that enables people, as individuals, as part of communities, to actually be seen and know that they're valued as humans, through that technology. And so as it relates to ed tech, then making sure that that process of creating ed tech, rolling it out, values those communities. So it values students of different backgrounds, of different socioeconomic levels and more. It values and incentive and what the teachers need to use, what the parents are expecting to get out of that technology, or can be supported by that technology to support the education of the ed tech that's, for K through 12 specifically. So I'd say, the big idea behind the tech that comes next is communities, and for ed tech specifically also center on the community.
I think that's a perfect the tech that comes next closer, unless there's any last burning questions. I mean, the tech that comes next will be built by hopefully a broader generation of perspectives and people than the tech that came before. So and many of the leaders in that space are on this call. I just want to express my gratitude to Colleen for hosting this event, for Afua for writing, and Amy for writing this really important book. I do think, grounding us, ending with Afua's mantra of starting with community is incredibly important and is the work of all of us. So thank you, Afua. Thank you, Colleen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'll pop into the chat one more time. I want to make sure that we really expand the surface area of where this book touches in a really thoughtful way. It brings in the voices of dozens of folks doing things differently. So thank you very much. And thanks for joining us here. Colleen, Afua, any closing remarks?
Just another word of thanks. So thank you for having me, Sarah and Colleen. Thanks for your insights, just even today and always.
We're so glad and grateful to you both for joining the conversation. Thank you so much. That concludes our program for today. I look for more opportunities to engage in great books. We'll be following up with you all, and we thank you so much for participating in our program. Thank you.